Okay. All right. Welcome to the stream. And I'm Dave Adalian. I'm with EarthSky.org. And today we're going to be talking to Eric Berger, who is the senior space editor at Ars Technica, where he covers everything from astronomy to private space to wonky NASA policy. And he's also an author with a new book coming up right away. We'll be talking about that later. But our main topic today is going to be Boeing and the Starliner crew capsule, which is currently stuck, maybe, at the International Space Station. Opinions vary. So, Eric, how you doing?
Doing great, Dave. Thanks for having me on today.
Hey, we're glad to have you. We're glad to have you. So, Starliner, um, it's got a checkered history. Why don't we? You want to start there, or do we want to start with where we are right now?
I think we can put a little bit of context on it before we get to the current mission. NASA awarded Boeing $4.2 billion back in 2014 to develop a spacecraft that could fly four crew members to and from the International Space Station. This was something of a competition because at the same time they awarded SpaceX $2.6 billion for its Dragon spacecraft.
About half the amount.
Yeah, less than that's what SpaceX asked for, and compared to what Boeing asked for, and so that was how it all shook out. SpaceX ended up delivering astronauts to the space station for the first time in 2020, so just about 4 years quicker than Boeing ended up doing it. But Boeing did finally fly its Starliner spacecraft. It launched about a month ago today.
Just a month today.
Yeah, and it had a lot of problems leading up to it. They flew one test flight without crew, had so many software problems and other issues. They were not able to dock with the International Space Station. They had to fly a second uncrewed mission, and after that, they had more problems with parachute design and with actually flammable tape inside the spacecraft. All of that's been solved now, and they did finally launch, as I say, about a month ago, and did reach the space station after a fairly harrowing trip to get there.
No kidding. And they were supposed to be there 8 days, was it? Was it 8 days they were supposed to be on orbit?
Yeah,
And
NASA was always
today, go ahead.
sorry about that. NASA was always a little bit fuzzy about that timeline. Could be 8 days, it could be 14 days, but it was expected that they would come home within a couple of weeks, and NASA has ended up extending it out to a full month, and really at this point they've left it open-ended while they work out some issues with the Starliner spacecraft.
Now, you pointed out in your reporting that there's only a 45-day certification for Starliner to be on orbit, and we're going to hit that in a couple of weeks, aren't we?
Yeah, they've got some battery issues on the spacecraft where they're rated for 45 days. But my understanding is that NASA will look at that data, basically assess the health of the batteries, and probably clear it for another 45 days. So while that did look to be kind of an issue, it sounds like NASA will be able to pencil their way out of that problem.
They do that a lot. They're good at that. So, it, but it was already, it's not just in trouble as a vehicle, is it? It's Boeing is in trouble as a company, especially here in their space flight. This particular aspect of their business. They're about
Yeah,
$1.5 billion over budget, aren't they? And years behind schedule. This was supposed to have its first test flight in 2015, I want to say. Is that correct? Or am I jumbling the timeline?
it was 2017 initially.
It was
Yeah.
2017. And so they didn't get off the ground for years after that. And it was only now that let me ask you this question. I've been wanting to ask this. Would you fly on Starliner?
Yeah, I think I would.
You
I
would.
certainly would. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, NASA has some pretty rigorous certification processes. And so they will go through this mission. They will address the problems with helium leaks that they've observed, with the RCS thrusters that they've observed. And I suspect they'll get around to fixing that. Um, the fact of the matter is, I probably wouldn't have a chance to fly on Starliner because I think it's not really commercially viable. The fact is that Crew Dragon, probably costs on the order of 50% less, and so I think Starliner will struggle to find a future beyond the 6 missions it's contracted to NASA to fly out over the next decade.
And that was one of the things that had to do to stay with NASA was agree to those additional flights to lock them in. And so there we are. They are, however, selling a seat. That was part of that same arrangement, I believe. So they added a seat to the crew capsule that they can sell. They can have a tourist on board.
Yeah, that was the plan.
That was the
they would,
plan.
that to have a commercial seat available for an extra passenger in future missions. My understanding, I'm told that plan has been put on hold. I think the message from NASA has been, I think that you ought to prove out the viability of Starliner before you go about selling commercial seats. I'm not sure how much demand there was, what the cost would be. I think it's depending on the length of the mission, but it's probably going to be at least 50 million, probably more than that, for such a seat and experience. So I'd
You
be
and I
surprised
aren't going.
You and I aren't going, Dave. Sorry to say, and I don't think probably they will ever sell those seats. Would be my guess.
Okay. Yeah, that's reasonable. That's reasonable. So how did SpaceX manage to outdo Boeing? I mean, Boeing is the big boy. Boeing, it is the granddaddy. What happened? How did that
Yeah,
happen?
Boeing was absolutely the gold standard in human spaceflight and in spaceflight. A decade ago when these contracts were awarded. The big difference is that this commercial crew contract was awarded on a fixed price basis. So that means that NASA would provide a certain level of funding, and then the companies could execute at that level of funding and break even. If they spent more, they would lose money. And in this case, you mentioned Boeing has lost about $1.5 billion. And we don't know how SpaceX did financially, receiving less money. I suspect that they at least broke even. The fact of the matter is, Boeing had not been used to operating in a fixed price environment. That the traditional way of doing spaceflight had been through cost plus, and that meant that a company was reimbursed for all of the expenses plus a fee. So it actually benefited a company to have longer, more costly contracts because they got higher fees for a longer period of time, and it kept their workforces engaged. So Boeing, I think, has really struggled to operate under this fixed price contract, and that's evident in the fact that they've really had to stretch out the timelines. I think they've been able to put fewer people on the program than they might otherwise would have liked to, and obviously since they've lost money, they've again just really struggled with that. I think that's really the underlying cause of the problems with Starliner for Boeing.
And that plays
And
back to their merger
just
with
sorry, just to
McDonald's, I
finish on that,
guess. Please.
just to finish up on that, SpaceX had operated as on a fixed price basis from the beginning, so it's kind of their natural environment. If you think about go back to evolutionary history, it's like SpaceX has always been on land, and you've got Boeing trying to crawl out of the ocean and evolve and to be able to operate outside of the seas for the first time and really struggling. And as a matter of fact, we've seen them, metaphorically speaking, crawling back into the seas. They've sort of, their CEO has said they're really not going to play in this fixed price environment anymore because they haven't been successful at it.
They don't seem equipped to do it, frankly. So let's talk about what you're doing. Let me just jump over here and we will take a look at, make sure I get the right one. I want to share something here. And that is, let's hope I get the right one. It's not there. Where is it? How strange. Well, my computer is failing me, so we won't play with that right now. Cancel that. I was gonna show the cover of your new book. Actually, I was going to start with. Well, you know what? Before we skip to that, how are the astronauts going to get home? How are Butch and Suni going to get back from the ISS? What are they going to do?
I would be shocked if they don't come back in Starliner. I have every confidence that NASA will, address the problem. So what they decided to do, on the way to the space station, they had a growing number of helium leaks. That problem is manageable. I think the bigger concern for NASA at this point is the fact that 5 of 28 RCS thrusters failed during the flight to the space station. They were able to recover 4 of those, but you don't like to see that kind of failure when you're operating a spacecraft in a critical environment. So what NASA's done is decided we're not going to bring them home after 8 days, 14 days, or even 30 days. We're going to leave them up there for a while longer. It could even go into August, I think, this mission at this point. And NASA has set up a study, along with Boeing, of some of those thrusters on the ground at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico on a test stand to see if they could recreate the conditions that cause these failures so they really understand what the problem is before they bring Butch and Suni home. And I think those tests will take place for the next couple of weeks, and depending on how challenging it is to identify the problem, that will push the mission into August. But I think even if they didn't fundamentally understand the root cause of the issue, they would feel pretty confident in Butch and Suni flying home in Starliner. There's probably a 1% chance, I would say, maybe that they don't. In that case, NASA could fly up a SpaceX spacecraft with 2 empty seats, and they could come back on that.
The thrusters that have failed, those are orientation thrusters.
Yeah.
Those are critical for the reentry phase. So if they don't function, but they are functioning now. They've got one that's no longer functioning. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So it shouldn't be a problem. There's nothing else wrong. They have plenty of helium. The helium system is currently shut off. They're not losing helium, and they have several times what they need in order to get back. So if they can't take Starliner, we're probably looking at a Dragon capsule from SpaceX. Do they have one sitting around ready to go?
There is.
How long would it take them to prep that?
Yeah, there is the next crew launch scheduled for August, and there are currently 4 astronauts manifested on that mission. They could pull 2 of those. The bigger challenge would be making sure that they had special spacesuits or flight suits for the crew, because those are different than the Starliner flight suits. But those could be put together in a matter of months. And so, NASA has options thanks to the fact that Crew Dragon, has now flown more than a dozen human space flights and has had, relatively minor issues along the way.
Minor issues. So it's a reliable craft. That seems to be the SpaceX, that's their idiom. They do things, they don't fail. But that's not how they start out, is it? I'm kind of leading into your book here. Why don't you tell us about how they developed versus how Starliner was developed and why that may have contributed to the success rate? Or do you think that's true?
Yeah, so SpaceX has a different design methodology. We talked about fixed price contracts before, and that's an important part of it, but also it's their willingness to fail in the early stages of a project. I mean, we've seen that very clearly over the last year and a half with the Starship, failures when they're launching from South Texas, this massive rocket that's exploded, and then it's gotten progressively further in flight, but it's not, carried out a nominal mission yet. And they've done 4 test flights, and that's how they operate. They design, they build hardware quickly, they fly it to just sort of see how it performs, and then they iterate on that. And so I wrote a book about the Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon spacecraft to understand kind of how we got here to this point where this upstarts company SpaceX can beat Boeing by 4 years at half the price of delivering human spaceflight to the International Space Station. And one of the key elements of that, of course, is the reuse by the Falcon 9 rocket. And so my book is called Reentry, and it really explores the development of the Falcon 9. They did not land successfully until their 20th mission. They had lots of, they firebombed the drone ship a handful of times. They landed rockets in the ocean. Their first efforts were with parachutes, and those were catastrophic failures in trying to get the rocket back. So they're willing to take risks in the early stages of development to move faster and ultimately do things better. And sort of we've seen that, right, with the Falcon 9 rocket. This rocket has now flown more than 350 times. It's landed more than 300 times. They're reflying boosters 20 times. They're reflying Dragon spacecraft, multiple times. And it's incredible. Their next closest competitor in the United States has launched, like 6 or 7 rockets this year, and they've launched, almost 70. So it's not really comparable what they're doing kind of with anyone else.
They're setting the new standard. But we have seen people trying to do what they're doing. In fact, yesterday we saw the Chinese give it a shot accidentally. You want to tell us what happened there?
Yeah, so there's a Chinese company called Space Pioneer, and
Space Pioneer.
China's had a growing commercial space industry for the last 8 to 10 years. The federal government there in China, the state enterprises will loan or share technology with these companies, and then they go raise private funding to try to develop them. And let me tell you, Dave, what there's at least half of companies in China that are trying to develop rockets that look almost exactly like the Falcon 9, and that's a very simple reason that the Falcon 9 is the safest, least expensive, and only reusable rocket really in the world right now. And so Space Pioneer is kind of the first to market with the Falcon 9. They were doing something called a static fire test where you hold the rocket down but test the engines and the propulsion system on a nominal flight to orbit. And a clamp or something broke, and this spacecraft or this rocket, which was just a couple of miles from a city of 800,000 people, broke off and launched and went, half a mile or a mile up into space or in the air, and then came crashing down. Fortunately, it didn't go toward the city; it went toward a mountain, and nobody was injured. But the Chinese space industry is coming very quickly, and they're copying the most successful innovators in the United States.
And so that explains why they've advanced so quickly. They're going to go to the moon. They've got their own space station. So your first book was Liftoff. And what is that? That covers what exactly? How far does that get us into the SpaceX story?
That's the very earliest years of SpaceX, basically from 2002 to 2008, and covering the development of their first rocket, the Falcon 1. And that was a rocket where the first 3 times out they launched it, it failed. Um, in some cases, pretty catastrophically. And in September of 2008, they were down to their last chance. Elon Musk had run out of money. He'd leveraged himself really heavily with both Tesla and SpaceX. And if they hadn't nailed that launch, the company would have ceased to exist. And it's the story of how, against all adversity, they pulled that one off. And it was, it's kind of the beginning of the SpaceX story. But to really understand, where they are today, you had to understand where they began with their original philosophy, which they've largely hewed to over the years.
So you should read Liftoff before you read Reentry. And
Yeah, the
Reentry
story.
won't be available. You've got time. Put it on your summer reading list because the next book isn't out until September. We'll see that one in the fall. That one is that one coming from Penguin, and the first one is from HarperCollins. They're both available. I think it's for the low price of $13.50 right now, or somewhere in there. So if you want to get yourself a copy, I recommend you do so. In fact, buy 4, buy 5 copies, give them to your friends, hand them around. So what else should
I
we talk
was
about today? Oh,
well.
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say it's this the reentry kind of picks up the story where left off, and there's didn't mean to say it that way, but there's lots of. I talked to all the original employees of SpaceX, the ones who made all the difficult decisions and did the hard engineering and this. They kind of continue into reentry, but there's a new generation of people that kind of picked up the baton and carried it forward to get to us to the point where we are today.
So we have a new set of characters with a new set of challenges. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what is the big challenge right now for SpaceX?
Well, I mean, the big challenge for them is building out Starship. They learned how to reuse rockets with the Falcon 9, and now they have to take that writ large with Starship. And there's a lot of pressure on them, right? Because NASA, you referenced China going to the moon. NASA is in this race with China to go back to the moon with its Artemis program, and it's signed up dozens of countries that are coming along. But really, the linchpin of that is the Starship vehicle, which will take astronauts from lunar orbit down to the lunar surface and then blast them off, basically launch a rocket from the surface of the moon and get back up and rendezvous with an Orion spacecraft to come back to Earth. So there's a lot of pressure on SpaceX to deliver this very ambitious vehicle, but to work with NASA, they're going to really have to prove its safety. And so the challenge is to start launching Starship safely and regularly, and then demonstrate a very challenging technology called in-space refueling, because you have to refuel Starship to go to the moon. And then you have to, really demonstrate the ability to launch with a liquid-fueled engines on the surface of the moon. If you think about it, Dave, when you watch a rocket launch today, you see the launch tower kind of right next to the vehicle, and you've got all these gases coming from the rocket, and then like at the last second, that launch tower like falls away and the rocket lifts off, and you've got all these people watching. Well, on the moon, there's not going to be anyone there to support that launch. It's going to have to do it all by itself. And if
Wow.
the Starship doesn't take back off from the moon, the crew dies. So there's a lot of pressure on SpaceX to build that vehicle.
There is a lot of pressure, but they appear to be up to the job. I don't think we'll see any rapid, unplanned demolitions or destructions. So RUDs. They've given us a new word here for our language. So back to Starliner. You think this project is probably just going to come to a close at the end of those 6 missions that they're contracted for? Is that what you think will happen? Will Boeing move to another system? What do you think is going to happen next?
Well, it's going to depend on whether they can really get Starliner flying every 6 to 12 months safely and reliably. And it's going to come down to what the costs to Boeing are to actually do that. We don't have any insight into that. The fact that they've lost a lot of money says that their operating costs are probably a lot higher than they projected. And at this point, probably their best bet is to just fly those 6 operational missions for NASA, take that money and then move on. There isn't going to be any other demand for Starliner. Probably there are commercial space stations coming along that are going to need some way to get astronauts to and from, but there's going to be like a 40 or 50% premium probably on buying a Starliner over a Crew Dragon. And since that's the most expensive part of any space flight, would you rather pay 40 or 50 million to get to orbit, or would you rather pay 70 or 90 million to get to orbit? I mean, it's going to be hard economically to justify the continuation of that vehicle. And Boeing does not build commercial to spaceflight vehicles for customers really other than the government at this point. It's not like their commercial airline business, right, where they're selling to all these different companies. It's really focused on the government. So if NASA's not going to come to them with a check for billions of dollars, they're probably not going to build a new human spacecraft.
That sounds what I think is going to happen. That sounds completely reasonable. And there are some other things going on that are exciting in space flight right now. We've got Sierra Space trying to get their Dreamcatcher up in the air, but they've been stymied by Vulcan United Launch Alliance trying to get its Vulcan lift vehicle certified, and they're in a hurry. What's going on there? Do you have any insight for us there?
Right. So United Launch Alliance has been working to develop the large Vulcan rocket, which really was they needed to do in response to the lower cost of the Falcon 9. And they need to fly it twice to get certified for national security missions. So the Department of Defense has contracted with United Launch Alliance to fly like dozens of payloads on Vulcan. And Vulcan is 3 or 3.5 years late at this point. So they're trying really to fly these 2 certification missions. Now, they did one in January. It was flawless. But they need to do a second one. And the plan for years has been to fly Dream Chaser. This is a winged aircraft, or winged space plane. Looks a little bit like the space shuttle, but much smaller. And its purpose is to carry cargo to the International Space Station, and then come back to Earth and land on a runway. It would be very cool if they can pull it off. But Sierra's been running into some technical problems, and they're still saying they're going to launch this year, but I'm pretty confident that mission is going to slip into at least 2025. And so Vulcan needs another payload to basically tick the box and do a second successful launch for the military. And since there's no Dream Chaser, the Amazon Project Kuiper satellites, internet satellites weren't ready. They couldn't find anyone else, and so they're just going to fly a quote dummy payload to a mass simulator to get this certification flight in the books.
Sort of like when SpaceX launched a Tesla. You need to have something in the cargo compartment. I wonder if they'll get creative like that. I kind of doubt it.
No, that's not really how they roll. They're pretty buttoned down organization.
They are.
But yeah, SpaceX did that with the Falcon Heavy. They launched Elon Musk's Tesla on that test flight. They actually went to NASA and said, "We'll give you a free launch and NASA wasn't nimble enough to take them up on that. SpaceX also on the second and fourth launches of the Falcon 1 launch mass simulators because they didn't have payloads.
Didn't have payloads ready to go. So what's the future of spaceflight look like from your perspective? Where are we going? What are we going to see? We're not going to see another SpaceX spring up out of nowhere, are we? What are we going to see?
Well, that's a big question, Dave.
It is.
I do think we're stepping into a really interesting and dynamic era. There's been a lot of criticism over the last several months about NASA and their approach to Artemis because it's complex, right? You've got Starship, you've got the Space Launch System rocket, you've got Orion. Starship has to launch 6 to 12 times to refuel itself in low Earth orbit before it goes to the moon. And why is it so complex? But it is an exciting trajectory from the standpoint of what SpaceX is trying to do, and now what Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' rocket company, is trying to do, almost the same thing, is have a reusable rocket and then spacecraft that can fly to and from destinations such as the moon and be fully reusable. And to do that, you have to have in-space refueling. And so this has kind of been where science fiction writers, where space thinkers have thought about, where the future, what will the future of space exploration look like? And it really has been distributed launch, and that means sort of multiple launches from Earth and spacecraft that remain in space and fly around and get refueled and go to the moon, go to Mars, go to wherever. And that really is this sustainable, reusable future. That's when humanity really becomes a spacefaring species. Because if you think about it, I mean, Apollo was fantastic, but it was 55 years ago. And, everything was stacked on one big rocket launch. It was all expendable. The only thing that came back was a tiny capsule, and that was put in museums. And so none of it ever flew again, and it was so expensive. We just did 6 missions to the moon and then stopped. So the future looks like what SpaceX is trying to pull off and what Blue Origin and other companies are moving to, sort of these fully reusable launch systems, in space refueling, and in space, tugs and things like that. It's going to be a little messy to get there, but NASA, I think, really has the industry on the right path.
Okay, so I guess we've done a pretty good job of covering where Starliner is and if it's coming home. And we will be watching right here on the live stream when it does that. So, check your YouTube. Speaking of which, like us, subscribe. And Eric, thank you so much for being here. I had a great time. Anything you want to add as we wrap up our little chat here? This was a lot of fun. It was great to talk to you. You really have
Well,
some
let me just think.
wonderful information.
Thank you. Let me just thank you, Dave, and your audience for having me on. And let me just add that this is just a super exciting time to be following the space industry. I've been doing it for a couple of decades now. It just continues to get more dynamic and interesting. And so, keep looking up.
And I can't wait to see what I glance at up there. There's going to be some fun stuff. All right. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Folks, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.